from the blackest corners of your mind, they call, pulling you deep into shadow, twisting your senses, keeping you from sleep. It's time to face your darkest fears. This is Tales to Terrify. Good evening, children of the night, and welcome. Well, the evening air has begun to turn crisp. The store shelves are starting to overflow with pumpkins and skulls, and that dreaded spice has invaded our precious coffee. As much as I hate to say goodbye to the warmth and sun of summer, I can't help but feel a little bit of an excited chill at the onset of autumn. Like many of you, it's my favorite season. Just as we mark the closing of the summer season, so too are we about to mark the closing of our current submissions period. We've had some incredible tales this go-around, so much so that we've had to enlist some extra help to read through them all, and make sure each and every submission gets the attention it deserves. Thank you to everyone who submitted so far, and also to the incredible crew that's helped us tackle this horrific deluge. Still have a tale that you're looking to slide in before it's too late? Don't worry. You've got until the end of this month, September, to get it in. But don't dawdle. Time moves strangely in these dark lands, and we'd hate for you to miss your chance. As always, TalesToTerrify.com/submissions has all the details you need. This week, our deepest, darkest thanks goes out to the newest member of our Patreon, Zach Lash. Thank you for helping to fuel this infernal machine, Zach. We couldn't do this without the support, of incredible fans like you. If you'd like to join Zach behind the veil, by now you know the drill. Patreon.com/TalesToTerrify. Check it out, sign up, and become one with the darkness. We have one tale for you tonight, which takes us across the scorching desert in search of survival and revenge. Our story tonight comes to us from Laura Davy. Laura Davy wrote her first story when she was in elementary school, and despite the fact that the plot didn't make sense, she kept on writing. She's been published in Amazing Stories, Apex Magazine, Escape Pod, Grim Dark Magazine, Grievous Angel, Factor 4, and more. You can learn more about her at lauradavy.com. Children of the Night, join me for Laura Davy's Devouring the Dead, first published in Grim Dark Magazine, March 2017.
The flesh needs to be at least 2 inches wide and 1 inch long, with hair. The soulless crouched down on desert floor and rolled up the corpse's sleeves stained with sand and blood before he continued. And when you ingest it, make sure not to chew. I pressed my fingernails into my palms, leaving painful crescent marks as I smiled down at the old man. He wasn't even looking at me, instead running his hand up and down the dead man's forearm. He ignored the sun's blistering heat and the stench of death and happily continued his unwelcome lesson. The hair has to be visible. These desert heathens may believe shaving their heads and faces protects them from me, but hair covers the entire human body. He turned and grinned at me. I mean, we are animals. The sound of a horse interrupted my lack of response. Captain Nyat rode up to us, sword strapped to her back. Frowning, she glanced at me before nodding at the Soulless. He was supposedly her superior officer, but I had never heard him give an order. Esteemed sire, she said without bothering to get off her horse, the battle has concluded with the loss of 1 soldier and 3 dear ones. I shall have the enemy dead brought to your tent. She looked at the corpse. And may I ask where you got that? I think he was an enemy scout, found a mile outside the settlement, brought to me by your people just a moment ago. You should finish up here. She turned back towards the village. We're about to burn the settlement, and you don't want to get caught in the smoke. He nodded, then looked back at the dead man's arm. Captain Nyat cleared her throat and waited until he looked back at her before she continued. Also, may I humbly remind you that you cannot teach your pet any rituals. No matter how cute a dog is, a bitch should know her place. I pressed my fingernails harder into my palms. The throbbing pain of my nails piercing my skin was too familiar. I wouldn't be surprised if I drew blood. After these massacres, I was often left with bloody hands. Captain Nyat rode away, and I looked up. The Soulless was studying me. Don't worry, Ty. She'll grow to like you. I didn't correct him. If he wanted to call me by his dead daughter's name, then maybe they'd continue to let me live. He pulled out a curved knife and with quick cuts removed a strip of forearm skin from the body. I felt the sting of bile rise up in my throat as he brought the bloody flesh to his mouth, tipped his head back, and swallowed it. Do you need me, esteemed sire? I asked. Get one of the hoods. I'll have this one finished soon. I hurried away but lingered near the camels as I got the black hoods. I wanted to take my time without looking like I was taking my time. A lock of the corpse's hair would be woven into that mocking spectacle that the soldiers called a hat, hair dipped in blood creating a tapestry of blasphemy. The Soulless always wore it on his head and laughingly called it his second hair. By the time I returned, the body had been transformed into a dear one. I stared at the milky white film over its eyes as it stood up. I shuddered and passed the Soulless the hood. Without ceremony, he covered the dear one's head. I had long ago guessed that dead eyes wouldn't be good for army morale. We returned to where the army had set up a temporary camp, and we traveled around the outskirts to avoid the tents and equipment. The Soulless's tent was hundreds of feet away and downwind from the camp. Like Captain Nyat had promised, there were fresh corpses already waiting for us. The Soulless got to work, and I stood beside him, watching. That night the soldiers were loud in their victory. They sang hymns and drinking songs, but no matter how much alcohol they consumed, they all avoided the Soulless's tent. In the morning, we rode on to find the next killing ground. The Soulless's tent was spacious by army standards, with enough room for several rugs, a cot, chairs, and a table. The Soulless cluttered the table with everything from books to toys. During long periods of encampment, Captain Nyat visited at least once a day, but otherwise we were left alone. On travel days, we rode camels at the back of the army with the dear ones following after. The dead were slower than the living, but they followed tirelessly. Whenever we would stop for the night and they were still miles behind, they would be waiting hooded outside our tent in the morning. Their hoods were removed before battle for what the Soulless gleefully described as a mental attack along with the real attack. The dear ones were slow but strong and would only stop if they were completely destroyed, usually by fire. Though once I saw one so hacked up it couldn't move and just twitched in a puddle of its own blood and guts. The dear ones were the soldiers' best weapon and most profane act, forcing the army to travel sluggishly to keep the pace with the dead. They never attacked without them. By the time the soldiers reached villages, Most were abandoned or contained only those who chose to fight. Over a week ago, we had made camp outside of town, and the army was slowly preparing for battle. The Solus and I stayed in his tent, sitting in our usual chairs. I played cards alone. I knew only one solitary card game when I was first captured, but I created more. "Dear," the Solus said to me, "would you mind fetching me some breakfast?" I nodded, pulled my scarf up to cover my mouth against the wind-blown sand, and left. I looked out onto what seemed like an endless desert, wondering how long I could survive without water, but I noticed a soldier watching me from the shade of one of the tents. There were always soldiers watching me. I continued with my task. I looked inside the cook's tent. Sergeant Enkef was taking a nap on his cot. I hesitated. Enkef hadn't been kind to me, but he hadn't been cruel either. And these people might turn on me for less than disturbing their sleep. But he was the one who told me that I looked like the Solus's dead daughter, which was why I wasn't killed when they invaded my village. I straightened my back and walked into the tent. The only one that could protect me was the Solus, and he wanted food. "Sergeant Enkef." He didn't move. I spoke louder. "Sergeant Enkef?" He shook his head and frowned, blinking himself awake. "What do you want, girl?" "Esteemed sire has requested food?" He sighed but sat up. "I'll make you a platter and send someone down with it." "Thank you." I left before he could say anything else and returned to the Solus's tent. The Solus looked up from a book he was reading and smiled when he saw me. I returned to my chair and continued my game. "May I enter?" Captain Yat called from outside the tent. "Please," the Solus answered. Captain Yat carried a covered platter filled with bread, cheese, and dried camel meat. There was no knife to cut the cheese. She spoke as I started to clear the cluttered table. "Esteemed sire, we believe the settlement holds enemy combatants. They might try assassins, so I insist you stay in our encampment." I hurried, hoping to finish making room on the table before the captain noticed me. When I moved a stack of books onto one of the chairs, the back of my wrist accidentally knocked a small wooden jewelry box off the table. The lid opened, and a melancholy tune started to play. I quickly picked it up and shut it. "What?" the Solus asked as he cocked his head, listening to the music. He looked over at the jewelry box in my hand. I quickly turned and put it back on the table. He stared at me. "You?" He approached me and backhanded me. I fell, my knees scraping against the rug, and my eyes watered. The tingling in my cheek felt less painful than my surprise. He had never hit me before. "What did you do?" he demanded. "What?" His face was contorted into a mask of rage, lips drawn back, revealing bared teeth. "I said, what did you do?" "I'm sorry," I said, shaking my head, and spoke without thinking. "I didn't mean to. There was just so much on the table. I didn't know it was important." "Not important?" His voice shook with anger and his dark eyes bored down on me. He raised his arm again as if to strike me, and then lowered it and smiled. You stay there. You stay there until I get someone to help you up." He smiled again but didn't move. The pain in my cheek burned, but I kept my hands on the rug. I thought of apologizing again, but I didn't like how he showed his teeth in what I had mistaken as a smile. This wasn't a smile. This was a display of aggression, like a snake coiled for a strike. "I didn't mean to," I said. I risked looking over at Captain Yat. She smirked. The tent door opened, and a male deer one shuffled inside. A black hood covered its head, and its clothing was so dirty that the ripped cloth was indistinguishable from rags. Its skin hadn't decomposed, and it looked the same as before it became a deer one, except a long strip of skin from its chest had been peeled off. "So, you like destroying other people's belongings, do you?" the Solus asked. "You know what your problem is? You have no fucking respect. You think you're the princess of this fucking unit and we're all here to serve you. Well, if you need a servant, I've got one here for you." With a flourish, the Solus removed the hood over the dear one's head and revealed my dead brother. My hands went numb. I whispered, "Rayerk?" "Oh, you don't like this one?" the soulless asked. Captain Yat barked out a laugh. He continued, "Do you want a different one? I'm not sure if I know which one was your mother or father, but I have your whole village here, and we can keep looking until we find them." I stared at the damnation that was once my brother until my eyesight blurred. I lowered my head down onto the rug and sobbed. That evening I sequestered myself amongst the herd of camels, huddling against them to combat the night's chill. 3 soldiers watched me, prepared to attack if I tried to steal an animal to escape these demons disguised as men. Sergeant Aincaf brought me food and water. "I heard what happened," he said quietly. "That wasn't right. We're not like that. We have to win this war. And the leaders and the priests, they both agree that people won't be damned if they use those powers this time." He looked up at the moon before looking back at me. "But it wasn't right. I want you to understand that I know that. Thank you for your words." He nodded briskly and started to walk away, then turned back around. "Let me know if you need anything." He left me alone with my thoughts. I had believed that surviving would be enough, that my memories would allow my people to live on. But I was wrong. As long as the soulless was around, a vulgar and damned version of my people would exist. It wasn't until the moon was well overhead that a soldier gestured for me to follow her to the soulless's tent. She didn't say anything as she held the tent door open. I went inside. The soulless was alone with his back to me. My chair had been knocked over, but everything else remained as it was. "Esteemed sire," I said in as flat and emotionless tone as I could manage. "You called for me?" He stood hunched over, looking like nothing more than a tired old man. He turned around and stared at the ground, then straightened his shoulders and looked into my eyes. "I'm sorry." He paused, and I wondered if he was trying to think of my name instead of using his daughter's name. He wouldn't be able to. I had never told any of these people my real name. He continued, "I'm sorry, but you have to understand. I can't have you touching any of my possessions, especially that jewelry box." He went to the table and picked up the box, held it in his hands, and smiled at it. "I was a sergeant before, and since the army was always on the move, I wasn't always around for Ty's birthday. But I was there for this one. She was an adult then, you know. No dolls for her. But this was perfect, and she loved it. He paused and gently stroked the lid of the box. "After I volunteered for my new position, I sold most of my belongings, but I kept this, and I don't want it to get ruined. You understand, don't you?" I nodded. "About that dear one. I know you were clinging to him when I found you at that village. Even though I saved you, that doesn't mean I could let a good corpse go to waste, right? Though I do apologize for showing him to you in such a manner. I let my anger get the best of me. Just don't touch my belongings unless I give you permission. Deal?" I nodded. He carefully placed the box on the table. "Good." He nodded and clapped his hands together. "Good, good. Want a hug?" I let myself be hugged, smelling the dried blood on the corpse's woven hair that he always wore. I didn't look up to see if I could find Rayerk's lock of hair among the rest. The first batch of corpses from the latest battle had arrived behind our tent. I had gotten used to intestine hanging limply from torn open stomachs, and how the flies would congregate on their unblinking eyes, but I hadn't gotten used to the smell of the dead. They stank of piss, shit, blood, and that almost sweet, putrid scent that followed death. The soulless and I stood alone looking down at them. He didn't respond to the stench or the gruesome sight. If anything, he looked excited. "Ready to get to work?" the soulless asked with a smile. "By now you should know what to look for. I can't give you a knife, but you can help me find where to slice." "Yes," I said eagerly. He wanted me willing, and it was time to play my part. "Great!" He clapped his hands together. "Let's get started, Ty." Esteemed father, I said. I waited a second for the soulless to notice the incorrect word. I mean, esteemed sire? He grinned at me. Yes? You've talked about these rituals before. If the rituals are so easy to do, why doesn't everyone create dear ones? He frowned. I felt my stomach tighten and realized I might have pushed him too far too soon. But when he nodded, I knew I had him. Because of the cost. It's not just the cost of your soul, like the priest once said. No. No one has come demanding my soul. He patted his chest as if his soul was still there. No. The cost is your life. With the creation of your first dear one, your life just got a lot shorter. And then there's your mind. You lose it slowly. The captain is always there, sword in hand, waiting for me to become fully mad so she can kill me and tell the general to send someone else with a new batch of dear ones. You mean another person couldn't use your collection of hair to control them? No. Once bonded, a dear one can never be given to someone else. They collapse and go back to being the boring dead again if their master dies. But then what happens if someone steals your... I risked a glance at the top of his head to the collection of corpse hair woven together. What happens if someone steals your hat? No one can steal it, silly. It's woven onto my head. He leaned toward me and in an exaggerated whisper said, The last part of the ritual, the part I can't really talk about, is that you use your own hair to tie the corpse's hair to. Some do it haphazard, but I like it all on the top. Stylish, you know? But the real secret is you have to bleed while you tie. You cut, you eat, you cut, you tie, you bleed. And now you've got yourself a dear one. Well, that, and you only live another 1 to 3 years with the end reserved to madness. But you've got yourself a dear one. Make them fight, make them follow, make them stand around with ridiculous hoods on their heads. It's not like they can complain anymore. He laughed at his own joke. I nodded, not trusting what tone of voice I'd use if I spoke. We should get to work, he said as he crouched down at the first corpse. Yes, I said, thinking about my family. We should. It was the 5th day of battle, and the army appeared to be losing despite the dear one's untiring efforts. Unlike most settlements, this town had been reinforced with barricades, traps, and experienced fighters. I sat in the tent in my usual chair playing solitaire, hiding from the unrelenting desert sun and the angry soldiers experiencing defeat for the first time since the war began. Tai, the soulless called out. Yes, esteemed father, I replied. Are you hungry? Yes, esteemed father. Could you be a sweetheart and get us something to eat? Yes, esteemed father. The camp was busy, soldiers running to and fro and not bothering to notice me. I passed a tent filled with wounded soldiers that smelled of medicine and blood. The sounds of their moans lingered in the air as I strolled to the cooking tent, where I hoped to find Sergeant Enkef. He was busy slicing bread and staring out the rear entrance at a stream of newly arrived casualties. A hunk of camel leg sat on a table with a large sturdy knife next to it. I had never had an opportunity like this before. I risked another glance at Enkef, then I slipped the knife into my hand and held it against my body. I turned and left. I tried to keep my stride loose and normal, but I felt the weight of the blade against my thigh. My hands began to sweat. No one stopped me. I was about to enter the Soulless's tent when I heard Captain Yat yelling. I ducked around the side of the tent, but stayed close so I could hear. Losing it! I can't protect you anymore. Maybe if you got rid of that bitch. Don't call Tai a bitch, the Soulless shouted. She's nothing like Tai, Captain Yat cried. Tai was my friend, and calling that heathen by her name, let alone parading her around the army, is an insult to Tai's memory. The Soulless said something too softly for me to hear. You're not the man I used to know, Captain Yat responded. I heard the flap of the tent's door, and Yat stomped away. I waited another minute for my heart to stop racing. Finally, I entered. The Soulless was alone. He held the jewelry box and gazed down at it. I stepped inside. The tent was cool, but I was sweating. The soulless looked up and grinned. "Ty, you're here." He held up the little box. "Do you remember when I gave you this?" "Remind me," I said, as I slowly took step after step towards him, watching as he studied that damn box. "I was in town. I gave you that big gift. Oh, what was it? You know, in that big box or something. But then afterwards I gave you this." He trailed his fingers slowly across the lid, a careful touch as if it were too precious to handle. "It's cheap, yet you loved it so." I was close enough to touch him. I stopped. The knife felt heavy in my hand. It cried out to be used, but my fingers refused beyond tightening them around the handle. I thought of Rayer's dead face, but I couldn't stop staring at this old man who softly smiled at the thought of his daughter. "You even brought it with you when you joined the army." His smile curled into a frown and he looked upward as if confused and the answers were above him. "You had it with you when you were sent to that skirmish on the border, right before those heathens killed you. They sent it back to me with your body." He looked at me, his mouth trembling and his eyes wide. "Ty?" I raised my arm and stabbed him in the neck with all my strength. My arms trembled as I twisted the knife, sending a spray of warm blood across the room. He stumbled backwards and I let go of the knife jutting from his throat. He gasped, letting go of the music box and clutching at the blood-slick handle of the knife. The box rolled towards my feet and the lid fell open. A melody began to play. I listened to its sweet song harmonizing with the soulless falling to the ground, convulsing. I heard the sound of footsteps. Dear ones appeared at the entrance, hooded heads turned towards me. I put my foot on the handle of the knife and looked down at this man who had spared only my life while condemning everyone else's. Lying sprawled on the rug in a puddle of blood, the soulless uttered a short sound. I wasn't sure if it was Ty or why. I heard the corpses getting closer and stepped down on the knife lodged in his throat as the music continued. The dear ones collapsed, their bodies thudding to the ground as if they were puppets whose strings had been cut. They had returned to true death. Maybe later I would have time to unmask them and give my people a proper burial. But later. I sat next to the man I killed and shut his eyes. I bent over and righted the jewelry box and shut the lid. Silence. It took me 3 tries to pull the knife out. I moved my fingertips, sticky with blood, across the rug, feeling comforting fabric underneath the stray grit of sand on top. I didn't let go of the knife as I pressed my hands into the rug. It was here. It was real. I was here. I was real. I had killed. With a deep breath, I examined the body. He was hairy. His arms, his legs, his chest. I cut the skin from his thigh. It tasted of blood, and I felt the bristle of hair against my tongue. Like he taught me, I swallowed without chewing. It didn't work the first time, but I kept swallowing back my vomit and the skin until finally everything stayed down. I looked up for a moment, willing myself not to throw up. "What the fuck?" Captain Yat stood inside the tent and looked at me, eyes wide, mouth gaping. She hesitated before reaching for the sword strapped on her back. I didn't hesitate. I ran at her, screaming. She held up her free hand as if to stop me. It didn't work. My knife scraped against her collarbone as she cried out, but it was easy enough to pull it out and plunge it even deeper into her torso. My hands were wet with sweat and blood, but I didn't stop. I stabbed her again and again. She made a sound, a liquid gurgling and broken words, and dropped to the ground. I sat on top of her and continued my work. I didn't stop stabbing even after she stopped moving. I waited to see if more soldiers would come, but the tent was far enough away from the rest of the camp that it seemed like no one had heard the noise. They had been looking outside for an enemy and had forgotten about me. But they would remember soon. The soldiers would eventually notice that there were no more dear ones. I had to finish. I returned to the soulless corpse and cut off a lock of long hair by the base of his neck. I wiped the hair and the blood still welled at his throat, then placed it carefully down so I could hold the knife with 2 hands. I cut open my scalp near the top of my head. I sharply inhaled at the pain, but it was no worse than my self-inflicted wounds during battles. I picked the corpse's hair up and let it soak in my blood. Then I wove his hair and my hair together, knotting it in a tangle at the end. I looked over at his face and watched as the dear one opened its beautiful, milky white eyes. I could feel my control over it, like gaining a new limb. It would walk for me. It would kill for me. I repeated the process on Captain Nyat. There was plenty of blood still seeping from her chest. When Enkef arrived, I was ready. My dear ones were ready too. "What have you done?" he asked softly, staring at my bloody hands. "Don't worry," I said with a smile as my dear ones held him down and I slit his throat. "You told me your priests and leaders said I wouldn't be damned if I used this power. So I will go and visit them too, after I visit every soldier in this army." I laughed in delight as I cut a piece of skin from Enkef's chest.
That was Laura Davies' Devouring the Dead, as read by Amy Paonessa. Amy Paonessa has been the producer and host of The Bloodlust, a horror movie review podcast, since 2014. She has narrated stories for various other podcasts, including Knife Point Horror and the Alexandria Archives. She's thrilled to read for Tales to Terrify, especially because she credits the podcast with reigniting her love for horror fiction. You can contact Amy through her website, thebloodlust.net. Thank you, Amy. Well, children of the night, the hour is late and we've run out of tales to tell. For now. Tales to Terrify is made possible by the tremendous generosity of our supporters on Patreon and PayPal. Incredible fans like Lestle Baxter, Amanda Carrillo, Amanda Gottfried, and Orion D. Hegre, whose generous support keeps these lights on and flickering ominously. If you're not a supporter, head over to patreon.com/Tales to Terrify. You'll find all kinds of perks, like ad-free episodes, bonus content, and one-of-a-kind collectibles. Every dollar goes back into this show, and we appreciate your support so much. Want another way to support the show that doesn't cost you a cent? Head over to Podchaser, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts and drop us a 5-star review. You'll not only put an unnaturally wide smile on our faces, but help new listeners discover our terrifying tales too. You can show your love of the show out in the world with some Tales to Terrify merch. TalesToTerrify.com/merch will take you to our TeePublic store, where we've got a great collection of creepy custom and curated designs. Tales to Terrify is produced by Seth Williams, Meredith Morgenstern, Andrew Gibson, Crystal Hammond, Spencer Disparty, and myself, Drew Sebastini, with original theme by Nebulous Entertainment. Tales to Terrify is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Join us again next week as we slake your thirst for darkness with more Tales to Terrify.